looking reasonably composed. Good evening, everybody. Peter Malcolm, where's Peter Malcolm? I've not got a Peter Malcolm. It's all right, just getting the names right. And Michael Winstanley, welcome. Familiar face at least. Apologies for absence. We've got Zara, Elijah, Manchester, Colin, McLaren, Oldham, and Pam Stewart, Wigan. Have we got any others at all? No? That's good. Okay. I've got no urgent business. Declarations of interest. I think I have one. Could I ask everybody to focus on the mics? I think we were a bit lacking last time.
Thank you, Chair. Just to be clear, I'm a retired fire officer and I'm in receipt of a Greater Manchester Fire Service pension, so I need to declare that.
Thank you for that. And then we'll move on to minutes of last meeting. Has everybody had the minutes of last meeting? Everybody had a chance to peruse them? Would somebody like to propose them? Okay, Yvonne and Peter, thank you, that's good. And then, without any further ado, presentation of the budget, which is Richard, I think.
Right, thank you. Apologies, this is a bit of a moving feast because up till today we didn't have a financial settlement for elements of the combined authority, and we've had that settlement lunchtime today, and in a sense we're a little further forward. I'll explain why. Some interesting developments, but I'll take you through the paper in order, really, and then pick up the sort of what's happened today in the settlement. It is. I know I had a conversation with the chair yesterday. It is quite a confused picture as to the overall combined authorities' financial arrangements, because whilst we're a single legal entity, we have a multitude of budgets and a multitude of funding sources, some of which fall within the remit of the combined authority, some within the remit of the mayor, and some are sort of dual responsibility, and therefore some of those fall within your remit and some of them don't. At the simplest, we'll start with the PCC precept, mayoral PCC precept. I think, as we've discussed before, that's something you're not responsible for. The mayor as PCC will determine that in consultation with the police and crime panel. However, at the end of the day, it will come back to the combined authority at its formal sort of budget setting meeting on the 20th of February for approval. So whilst the mayor determines that, legally the combined authority has to set that precept for him, and it will appear on the council tax bills as a mayoral PCC precept. That's the simplest. Waste is something else that's for this year not your responsibility, falls for the Waste Disposal Authority. I think at the meeting later you'll look at the transition arrangements, and in a year's time waste will become part of the CA's budget and fall within this, but not for the current year. We then get into a slightly more complicated picture. We've got a fire budget, which is part of a mayoral general budget, so covered by a single precept issued by the mayor, which includes fire, economic development, and other general functions that are mayoral functions. And at the moment, mayoral functions are fairly limited. Transport strategy. Some aspects of bus reform in the future will fall under that. Spatial development strategy, but not the district plans for spatial development. So a sort of fire plus type precept, which will be approved by the mayor, but can be vetoed by the combined authority by 2/3 of the CA members. Come back to that in a little while. We then got a transport levy as normal. The roughly £200 million paying for concessionary fares, bus support, and the capital investment. That's largely a combined authority responsibility, but there's a carve out of a part of that which is part of the mayoral precept, and this is a bit of a moving feast. We had council's opinion last week as to whether work preparing for bus reform was a mayoral function or not. Where council advised that was not the position, it was a CA responsibility. for the majority of next year, because the government order is not in place at the current time. So we've got the normal transport levy. We've then got the normal combined authority contributions coming from the districts for CA functions and for AGMA functions. And despite the fact that most people think AGMA is dead, it's still alive and just about kicking. It will have a budget of probably a little more than £1.5 million next year. What was the Section 48 grants transfer across to the combined authority to be a combined authority mayor and social fund or some such title, but is transferred across to the CA, but there is still a residual AGMA budget. So it's quite a confused picture, and I say it is. So I've got a cough and everything at the moment, so if I go outside and die, don't worry. Perhaps some of the firefighters are trained in resuscitation to keep me going. We had a TFGM board meeting and they nearly put me outside, I think, today. So it is a bit of a confusing picture. It is moving as we speak as to what's a mayoral and non-mayoral functions. And perhaps pick up what was in the settlement today in terms of this. The two bits, the funding we get from central government deals with fire and mayoral functions. Fire, I presume, is as we expected, but in terms of mayoral functions, government has set no limit on the mayor's precept. As you'll know from your own districts, the referendum rules set percentage increases in council tax. The Secretary of State has chosen not to set any rules for the non-PCC part. There are rules for the PCC part, but not rules for the other parts of the mayoral budget. So the fire and other mayoral functions are not subject to any government restrictions. There's sort of health warnings that says we'll be looking at you and see that you act responsibly, but they've not chosen to set any government rules for budget setting for the coming year. The other bit we're still waiting to see about is in the budget, the Chancellor announced a mayoral capacity fund, £12 million over 2 years for the mayoral CAs. That's between 6 mayoral CAs before we run away and we think we've got £12 million. And again, there's nothing as to what the rules are, the amount we may get, which years we may get in, and what it may be used for. I have a conversation tomorrow with CLG, which I shall be asking them, when will we know? I mean, it's probably £1 million or so a year, you might guess. Six CAs for 2 years, £12 million equals something in the order of £1 million. So it's not a large sum of money, but whether it's going to be equal shares or pro rata population or something else, we don't know. And whether it can only be used for mayoral functions or non-mayoral functions isn't clear at the present time. So there's lots of bits of the jigsaw that are not in place at the present time. So apologies that, in a sense, the report paints a picture of, it's a bit like this, but actually it's moving as we go. So I'll pause there, and then I'll take you through the report. It's just a bit of scene setting as to why it's a bit of a confused position. We are unique, as you probably know. No other CAs have police and fire responsibilities, but equally no guidelines have been set by government for any of the other mayoral CAs which may be contemplating a precept.
So before you kick off on the report,
Yeah.
has anybody got any questions on that introduction? John Bell.
Rich is quite right. It is rather complicated, and I wouldn't expect these are early days in the in this environment we're in at the moment, only taking over the elected mayor from April. But have you given any thought to how this will be presented to the public? Because I do think it's the public could be quite confused of what the CA does anyhow, and with the police budget, with the fire budget, the transport levy, etc., are you going to do it? Are you going to present it in one whole comprehensive, combined authority figure, or are you going to separate them all up to the public?
I mean, they are going to have to be separated because they've each got their own funding sources. So if we take the police budget, that's I'll say freestanding, very much ring-fenced. will appear on the council tax bills as the mayoral PCC precept, and you can compare. We're talking to your district colleagues at treasurer level about the presentation on the bills, which is not simple, and then the sort of notes that will be attached to it, although they're usually offered through the sort of internet rather than pieces of paper these days. But we will clearly identify the police component of it, and there'll be a comparison probably on the back of the bill, I think, as to what that is this year, so people will be able to work out it's gone from X to Y. In terms of the mayoral general precept, again, that will appear on the bill, but there's no direct comparison for that to the fire bill, because potentially it includes other items. But again, we'll show the mayoral general bill on the front of the bill, and then a comparison to the fire precept probably on the rear of the bill, where we show the policing component. There's clearly a conversation about what supplementary information is available to council taxpayers, and a conversation with district treasurers that how far that's sort of signposted through to the CA website to explain that, because at the moment people access all that information through the district website, and colleagues are clearly keen to see that the CA and the mayor are accountable for the decisions that are taken on the CA budget.
I think there's a good opportunity to explain to the public this is, to how the CA does operate. I think, if it's used right.
I think the point's taken, that there is a message to get over. The things like the the transport levies, much the same as before, so there's not a lot of new use in there. There's some marginal movement between the mayoral precept and the levy, but the districts usually account for the levy obviously through their own budgets. There is usually an explanation that goes out about the transport levy, but I think the mayoral bits are the bits that are going to need some explanation, because the bill is going to be quite confusing. Again, government's given more flexibility to districts as to what they increase their council taxes by. There's more flexibility to PCCs, so there's going to be quite a lot of movement in the bill. So I think all parties are going to be trying to explain what is going on and why. But I think it's going to be, with the social care precept as well. Well, I think district colleagues equally to explain possibly further increases in district bills and the social care precept, which I know has had a lot of attention in the past from the public, sort of saying, what's this figure for? I think all of you probably have another tranche of the social care precept on top of your own increases, plus the policing component, plus a mayoral general precept which includes fire, and we're going to make it clear on the bills that it does include fire, because again, no other mayoral PCC will have fire in that. So our figure, the fire bill is £60 at the moment, band D. So I'm not saying what the overall precept will be, but it'll be 60 plus, whereas other districts may have, or other mayoral CAs may have £5 or £10 or something. So we need to get over that it includes a different range of functions, and there'll be some explanatory text with the bills that sort of points to a change in functions.
Okay, so any other comments about the overview? No? So on to the report, Richard, thank you.
Right, we start off by just giving you a bit of a run through the forecast position for the current year. As I say, AGMA and the combined authority budgets are relatively small. The net budgets are around £10 million, funded through district contributions, which are largely population-based, although there's some slight tweaks in that. We're on the sort of first background page of the report that went out. The districts contribute largely pro rata population, some small variations where the city council picks up a slightly larger share of things like Marketing Manchester costs. In terms of the AGMA budget, we're predicting a small overspend at the present time around the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. I think you're well aware that the timeline on that has slipped, that further work is being done on it, and there are increased costs associated with that. In terms of the Combined Authorities Economic Development and Regeneration budgets. There is an underspend, largely a result of vacancies as the staff have been brought together, offset by some additional legal costs. The amount of legal work, particularly around the Constitution, this year has been quite substantial. And then in addition, we're just finalising the figures for the mayoral election costs. The cost of the elections did fall on the combined authority. We did make representations, including direct representations to the Secretary of State about government providing some or all of the funding for the mayoral elections, but that was rejected. And we had a £4 million budget for that, based on what a sort of normal cross-GM election has cost in the past for referenda or the PCC precepts, and it looks as though we're going to be marginally underspent on that. So there's possibly around £250,000 spare on that. The transport budget is just short of £200 million, although the levy this year was substantially reduced. We transferred resources between transport and waste in the current year to deal with the possible implications of the wind-up of the PFI contract. Those resources actually haven't been needed by waste and will be returned next year through adjustments in the levies for transport and waste, but the gross budget for transport is about £200 million. The TFGM side of that, Transport for Greater Manchester side of that, is broadly on budget, I mean, plus or minus a few £100,000 there, but there are underspendings on the cost of funding the capital programme, particularly the Metrolink, where lower interest rates and the fact we've been avoided external borrowing will lead us to an underspend of about £3 million. Fire, this was written, I don't know whether Dawn or others want to comment on this, but this was the position as at the time of writing, with a big underspend on fire resulting from vacancies. But I think there's been developments since then, which I'm not sure whether you've touched on already, but you might want to update on what the Mayor has said.
Right. Thank you. Probably one of the things I'd like to confirm is that the firefighters' pay award, or at least how it's perceived as an interim pay award of 1%, has now been agreed. And then since the paper was written, the Mayor has announced that we, as a fire authority, will seek to address some of the deficiencies due to the vacancies by providing overtime for 6 months as an interim measure. So the underspend that has been predicted here obviously will be substantially reduced, probably almost up to 2.5 million in this financial year, with another 2.5 into the following one. And we're also making sure that we speed up our recruitment process in order to fill those vacancies. We've also talked about in this report the fact that the savings targets for next year in the Integrated Risk Management Plan, those will not actually be delivered next year. We will use the reserves to meet that funding gap, giving the Fire and Rescue Service time to provide the Mayor with more information around the Integrated Risk Management Plan, which will be developed for the next financial year. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Back to Richard.
as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the mayoral general precept, the combined authority can reject the mayor's proposals on a 2/3 majority and eventually impose their own, which they would then vote through. Hopefully we're not contemplating that situation, but the statute provides that. In terms of the PCC, there's a sort of parallel process where the Police and Crime Panel can ask the mayor to reconsider his budget proposals for the policing side, but he then, providing he amends those, then they have no further say, and the amendment can be as little as changing a penny, I think, off the precept. So it's a sort of fairly notional rejection of the PCC budget. But in terms of the mayoral general, including fire budget, the CA members can impose their own budget if they wish on a 2/3 majority. Hopefully, we'll get all of that settled at the 26th of January meeting. The extra bit added in is then we need a special CA meeting to agree the precept, which is timetable for the 20th of February. This is because although the mayor determines the PCC precept and the mayor and or the CA determine the mayoral general precept, it is the combined authority as the legal entity who actually have to make the overall precept. It's effectively two precepts. They will appear as separate figures on the bill, but that does fall to the combined authority on the 20th of February. That's a date selected because I think the first of your councils are meeting on the 21st, on the Wednesday, so we have had to sort of interject a special meeting so that you can carry on your processes back at the ranch. By that stage, obviously districts approve them for incorporating in the overall council tax bills. You can't change them. So I think it's a bit of a formality when it comes through, but they do need to be included in the overall figures. As I mentioned earlier, we are talking to district treasurers and revenues officers about the billing arrangements for this and how they're presented on the bill, not least because of the software limitations. That anytime you try and change a council tax bill, it's because they're all outsourced. The firms who do it are not the easiest to get to change things. So we are working with them to try and get a sensible presentation. Thankfully, even if we get the presentation wrong, the bills, as long as they have the right amounts on them, are still legal. So even if we don't quite follow the regulations in terms of how you have to present what you are, they're still legal bills, so you can carry on and collect them on your and our behalf. That's an important discovery along the journey. Some of the budget to pause there before we go into the members have any questions on the timetable.
So on that, questions? John McCann.
Yeah, I have a slight issue on a democratic basis with the fact that the leaders will be voting on the GMCA, AGMA and GMFRS budgets prior to that being presented to the district council meeting. And really, should we not be looking at the timetables differently so that the leader is actually mandated by his own authority as to which way he should vote?
I think the leaders sit on the CA as individuals, don't they, rather than as mandated by their councils. I mean, I'm not aware of what processes go on back in individual councils to discuss such matters, but constitutionally they form the CA and have the vote.
That might be the case, but it's totally undemocratic, isn't it?
I think we'll take that comment back. I think that's for district. Sorry, for leaders to consider how they handle that.
Any other questions so far? Onward.
But just some of the budget considerations then. The first is the pay award. I think all of us have been expecting that the continuation of the government pay policy and the 1%. And I think most people had budgeted on that basis. You may know that the local government employers announced recently a pay proposal to staff, which would add 5.6% to the pay bill over the next 2 years. It's a 2% per year general offer, and then a reconfiguration of the pay spine at the bottom end quite substantial reconfiguration, which adds about another 0.8% each year to the pay bill. So that's 5.6% overall. That has a potentially quite a big impact, because whilst the number of staff within the sort of CA's remit directly covered by that are relatively small, it's staff within Churchgate and the, I'll call them support staff within the fire service, they're the only ones directly affected by that. Clearly the firefighters, police officers and police support staff, will it become a benchmark for public sector pay in the sort of local government scene is a question that's certainly in my mind. So and for TFGM, their staff are on different but pretty much parallel terms and conditions to local government staff, but negotiated through the passenger transport executive. So that is clearly one issue that has emerged recently and will need to be addressed in setting budgets as to what we provide for pay and how we fund it. The government in announcing, for example, the funding for flexibility for PCCs on the police, make it clear that there's no extra funding for police officers pay, and that's expected to be dealt with through the flexibility that's been given in the precept. So that's just, I think, where government are coming from in terms of we've given you some flexibility and you have to deal with the issues. Mayoral General Precept, as I've mentioned, comes in effectively two parts, the fire part and the other parts of the mayoral budget. That's a moving feast as we work out what our mayoral powers, transport strategy, the mayor's own costs, and some elements of the spatial development strategy at the moment are those things identified as mayoral precept components. But the CA leaders can reject that. Fire and rescue, this was written prior to the announcement, so it's a bit out of date now as Dawn has filled in. So the budget will be reworked to reflect the decisions by the mayor and deputy mayor, and the degree to which we need to fund those from reserves and deliver potentially other savings need to be worked out fairly quickly. We do have another meeting identified with the Oldham and Salford treasurers and leaders for early January, so that'll be work going on in the next couple of weeks to get that in front of the leaders. Mayoral general budget outlined there, what is contemplated for that. The conversations with CLG had been running. They had asked us to put forward ideas of what a notional budget might include, because all the thinking up to today was they would set a budget limit for the mayoral precepts and apply the referendum rules to them. So we have been in dialogue with them. It's been a one-way dialogue. We've been telling them the sort of things we wanted to be covered, and they said they'll be back in touch with us. And they haven't been until today, when they announced that there will be no restrictions on the mayoral budgets. There's a direct letter, as well as part of the settlement, they've written to me directly on that point. We go on to explain the sort of ring fences that apply within the mayoral and non-mayoral budget, and at the moment there's a fairly hard ring fence between the combined authority funding through the transport levy, for example, and the mayoral funding of transport parts. There's an outstanding government order that we should be in place over the summer, should have been in place last summer, but something got in the way, called the general election, and all work ceased. But that will allow the districts to fund part of mayoral transport functions through a statutory charge in future, but that's not in place at the current time, and that would be used to potentially fund concessionary fares and bus support for the future from existing sources. So leaders have made it clear they're prepared to continue the current level of input that the districts have into transport funding through this statutory charge, but say we haven't got the provision for that at the present time. And again, as we report the fire and non-fire bits, we're working in a sense almost splendid isolation at the moment, but they will need to be brought together into a proposal, and that is something the mayor will need to consider what's the balance in there between mayoral, the various mayoral functions. Transport, TFGM are working on the transport levy budget, working with the leaders of Bury and Wigan on that. They're looking at a number of emerging priorities and how they're funded, things like congestion, air quality, and things arising from the Greater Manchester strategy. They've got the issue of the pay award. They've budgeted for 1% for their staff. You might expect that the conversations with the trade unions are about matching the local government offer. That would add another £400,000 or so to their pay bill. And then we're working through the GMCA general budget and include AGMA in that, because it's a bit of a moving feast as things move between them. Those district contributions total 10.3 million at the present time, funded through the district councils. In addition, again, some of you will be aware that Greater Manchester has participated in a whole range of business rates pools and pilots, including the 100% pilot from 2017-18. We have earned additional money through that, and we had expected around 8.5 million to be available at the centre for 16-17, so arising from 16-17 closure of accounts. We now know DCLG wish to review all of those figures, because I think the claims that have gone in, not just from us but from other pilots, have been in excess of their expectations. So I think they're going to sort of unpick them and see what they are. I think we're confident we'll get the money. The understanding with leaders, some of this money will go back to districts directly. Those who've earned in quote marks the money through growing their rates base will keep some of the money. And the agreement with leaders at the last meeting was that the combined authority would retain only those amounts that it needs to fund agreed priorities, items arising from the Greater Manchester strategy, for example, potentially put aside for future priorities and pressures, and the next mayoral elections is one of those things we're going to have to fund. A lot will be alongside local elections and therefore be marginally cheaper than the £4 million this year, but we will need 3 million plus for that in 2 years' time. But to the extent that monies aren't required for that, then they would be passed back to districts. So I think we're well aware of the pressure on district budgets and the need to repatriate as much money as possible to support districts in setting their own budgets. The 100% business rates pilot that relates to 17-18, we won't know for some time as to what the outcome of that is. And whilst I know some district councils will be budgeting to take account of retaining some of those resources at a local level, I'm not proposing that for the combined authority in the coming year, because I'm one step removed from the decisions taken at district level as to their estimates and close down of their business rates accounts. And I know last year one district that thought it would generate a relatively large surplus of business rates was hit by a whole raft of appeals at the end of the process, and turned out with a very different figure. And had I budgeted for that, I would have been embarrassed. So I'm not prepared to budget for the figures that I don't know are pretty safe, which is why we're using the 2016 surpluses at this present time rather than expectation of 17-18. I know districts some districts are in a different position on that, but you have more control. Not that you control the appeals, but you can at least control how you assess what appeals are going to be and how you account for those. So you will find a different treatment across districts and across the CA and districts. But I think all leaders from the CA side are committed to sharing as much of that back with districts and not retaining monies centrally that we don't need. The other work we're doing is to align the resources within Churchgate House to the Greater Manchester strategy, so that we're clear we're delivering programmes that have been agreed by Greater Manchester rather than some other priorities. There's clearly an infrastructure to run here. There's scrutiny meetings, CA meetings, accounts to close. There's a back office going on, but in the sense we've got policy and strategy, then we're aligning it to the Greater Manchester strategy. The final thing on here is the schedule of contributions from districts in the current year, and we've adjusted these, as I mentioned earlier, for the waste transfer of resources from transport. And so we've grossed up these to what would be a normal level of transport contributions, so you can see the amount of money going into the central CA, not waste, that's excluded from here for this year, but just so you can see how much each of you are contributing towards those sort of central activities. By far the biggest proportion are the transport levy. Someone else has got my cough, I think. Right.
Thank you for that. Any questions, please? Right, I'm going to start with the round. Let's get some lists.
Thanks very
Start
much.
with Sheila.
I'm sort of a bit overwhelmed by all the uncertainties, actually, and it's sort of, nearly every heading you're coming to, you're saying, well, we're really not quite sure about this yet. So one of the things I'd like you to clarify, you said that you've not been given an actual percentage for the mayoral budget. Now, I think at first you said they just hadn't given us one. And then they said there would not be one. Now, there's a difference there, isn't there? They might have just omitted to give it to us, or they haven't decided what it's going to be yet. But if they've actually said there will be none, then that's different, isn't it? I just wondered which it was.
They're not anticipating there will be one.
Oh, right. That's not
So,
nearly then.
yes.
Nearly saying there won't be
Yes,
one then.
yeah. I think what they then went on to say is they will be, watching how mayors
obviously, yes, it has to
perform
be within
and
reason. Yes,
within
exactly.
reason. But yes, I think the issue they faced was that some mayoral combined authorities may have precepts. West of England, for example,
Right.
the legislation doesn't permit them to have one. So you've got mayoral combined authorities in different positions. The mayors have all got different functions. So if you look at Greater Manchester, transport strategy is a mayoral function. In there, if you go to the West Midlands, I think something called network resilience is a mayoral function. Well, that's a different transport function. So we're all different, and I suspect they've struggled to get their heads round what are, can you take a consistent approach? You've then got things that are coming through. So we've got an existing working on a transport order, which should have been in already, but got delayed. That won't come into the summer. That will fix new mayoral responsibilities around transport. We'll probably budget for those that come later in the year, but not those that are at the start of the year, because they won't be a mayoral function. So it's such a moving feast. I suspect they've decided that it's in the all too difficult camp to fix something.
So through you, Chair, they're not just giving us enough rope to hang ourselves. They themselves don't really know what would be a reasonable figure.
Yeah, you might think they're putting mayors on trust for how they will react to this, but there's so much other flexibility being given to districts. An extra 1% for districts, extra £12 for PCCs. So all the way they seem to be pushing the decision making much more back to a local level. Not that it will solve all your financial problems, as you'll know from your own pressures. An extra 1% on your council tax bills, I suspect, will go nowhere to actually funding the things that you need. But so I think we've all been caught out by the settlement not being quite what we would have expected. I was expecting a figure to be set by CLG, but they've not done so, and they're not going to.
Thank you. Luke.
Thank you, Richard. Earnback is mentioned in passing in here. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that, the earnback policy, because it's not really mentioned much these days, but I'm aware it's going on in the background and there's a lot of uncertainties associated with it, so I'd like to know a bit more about that. The second thing is related to the business rates supplement. That's the 2% that we would propose to be able to levy on business rates, but with the consent, of course, of the LEP. Where's that got to? I gather that it wasn't in the Queen's speech, therefore it's not coming up this year, but that obviously leaves quite a hole in some of the plans in all sorts of strategies, left, right and centre. And the third thing is, perhaps this is a stupid question, but how does this relate to revenue capital splits? Where's the revenue, where's the capital, where's all of that within these figures? Thank you.
Right, earn back. This goes back to the original devolution deals where they agreed a funding stream of £30 million for 30 years, so 900 million in total to flow through to the initially Greater Manchester. A number of other people have then got similar arrangements. For some it's 30, I think West Midlands is 33 and Tees Valley is 15 or something. So they're not all the same figure, but they're broadly the same principle. That funding is guaranteed for the first 5 years, and then there's a review process, an independent review, to recommend to the Treasury whether the next 5 years of funding is going to be granted. And that's the first 5 year review we'll be looking at. How have you delivered with the first 5 years' money? So in 2019, they'll look at what are we doing with that money. Is it delivering what we said it would? Subsequent reviews may look at the sort of economic impact of the investments we're making, but clearly by the end of the first 5 years we won't have actually have things up and running and delivering. For us, the earn back arrangements are predicated on funding the what's called the SEMS scheme. Certainly for those who live in Stockport, we know it to our disruption in the south of Stockport. I live on the route, so I know about it. So that's funding a 290 million pound scheme, which received 165 million of DFT grant and 105 million from earn back and 20 million from other sources. It's also funding the Trafford Park Metrolink extension, 350 million pound scheme. There's a degree of capital in there, so there's a sliding scale in capital. For the first year we got all 30 million of capital. By the end of the 5 years, I think it's 15 capital, 15 revenue. So there's capital grant in there, which is at the moment has been funding this Thames Highway scheme, and then Trafford, and the revenue side is funding the capital financing cost of borrowings and debt repayment on the Trafford Park line. So that will appear in the budget when we do it. Because interest rates are low at the moment, there are some temporary underspends on that. There was £2 million underspend last year, and the CA and Mayor have agreed that will fund the concessionary for the, I call them the WASPy concession. I know it stands for women, they're getting the state pension age increase for women, and the CA agreed a scheme to allow concessions for a limited range of people caught by those changes. That was estimated at 2.8 million. That was funded from some underspends on on earn back. So it will appear in the budget, but is largely committed, certainly in the long term, committed to funding those capital schemes. The business rates supplement, this is 2p in the pound rather than 2%. It's actually double. 2% is about a penny on business rates, so it's double that. It would generate something in the region of 40 million plus per annum in Greater Manchester. It was in the draft local government finance legislation that fell at the election, in the bill that was dealing with 100% business rates retention. It is going to be reintroduced for West Midlands as a power equivalent to the district council. So each of you have got that ability at the moment, subject to a referendum. No district has utilised that. No district anywhere in the country has utilised that at the present time. But that is going to be a power made available to West Midlands following a referendum. So the consultation with the LEP has disappeared, and it's now a referendum would replace that. That is something the Mayor and the Combined Authority need to decide whether they want to take forward those discussions with government in the future. But at the moment, that power does not exist. Sorry, I've eaten all my cough sweets. And then on the capital side, I mean, there is a parallel capital programme which I've not dealt with here. It's mainly transport related, and then the local growth fund monies, which again are probably 2/3 transport related, and then funding things like skills capital, local productivity programme, and the like. So I'm happy to bring something back to you next time on the on the capital side, if you like. That's at the moment resources are allocated and have been agreed by the CA. There are potentially some new funds in the Transforming Cities Fund that have been announced that the CA hasn't given consideration. Thank you. To yet as to how those will be utilised, but the rest of the capital resources are allocated to transport or non-transport schemes. Fire gets no capital resources from government. That has to be funded and has been funded through revenue underspends in the past. We do have borrowing powers for fire. We could fund those through borrowing if we needed, mainly stations and vehicles and appliances. So there is there's a fire capital programme as well. When you look at the totality, transport is 95% of the figures at the current time.
Back to you.
Thank you. I think that would be particularly helpful, given that what you've spoken about just there seems to indicate there's quite a lot of interplay between those two budgets around particularly business rates and impact and so on. So there is quite a lot of interplay, so it would be quite useful.
Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Just two questions about business rates retention, if that's okay. So the first one was, I just would quite like to understand why the cost of a mayoral election on the same day as local elections is about £3 million, and when it was on its own, I think it was either 4 million or 3.75 million. Just to explain that, because it doesn't sound right initially. I'm sure there's an answer. The second one was you talked about the preference to be return as much as the business rate retention as possible to individual boroughs, which I understand, but I assume there are winners and losers in doing that, because some people have been better at attracting new business than other places, or that's just happened naturally. And I just wondered, on the back of the envelope, what that sort of winners or losers situation was in doing that, and who would fare better in that.
Election costs. Yes, I think I started from your position where you think it would be quite a lot cheaper to run two on the same day. The advice from the elections people was that don't assume it's as cheap as you might think. The big saving comes in the operation of the polling stations, so the hire of the buildings and the setting up and running of polling stations. The poll cards, though, need to be separate. The poll postage is separate. The counts will be separate. Obviously, they're sequential. You'll do one perhaps on the night and the next one on the next day, but you've got two teams of staff working on those. For the mayoral costs, a big cost was the election booklets, the candidate booklets, over £500,000. That's a cost that falls wholly on the mayoral elections. So, yes, there are some savings, but the advice from the elections people is it's not as much as you think. Think around the £3 million mark rather than the £4 million mark. And clearly there'll be inflation, postage costs will have gone up and the like. So I have taken advice. I've not done a detailed budget yet, but it's not as cheap. Had there been a general election on the same day, and had we not had the election this year, we would have been due a general election at the same time, and therefore a three-way split, which again would have saved a bit of money because the fixed costs would have been spread over the three elections. So the calling of the general election this year actually has cost us some money in 2.5 years, 2020. But yeah, the business rates retention, it's quite a complicated picture, but you're right. The initial retention of monies, some will accrue at the centre, and the rest will accrue to the districts that have generated the growth. That will be largely Manchester, Salford and Trafford in the first instance. So they're the big winners so far. I think 5 of the 10 generated growth in the growth pilot that's operating in 2016-17. But I think those were the 3 big figures. I think 2 others generated slightly small amounts. When we get to the 100% scheme, retention, the numbers that I've seen at the moment suggest that everybody is a beneficiary from that, but again it's not equal shares. There are much bigger shares in the central bits of the conurbation rather than more outlying bits. But those are that's why there's the sort of conversation about how much is retained locally and how much, and the the longer term agreement is a 50-50 initial split, and then if the combined authority doesn't require and the leaders don't allow the CA to retain that 50%, that will be passed back to districts on a formula still to be determined. So certainly under the 100% scheme, everybody is benefiting, but they're not all benefiting equally so far. But that has been the picture of business rates growth and council tax growth, which is not consistent across the conurbation.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? John?
Right, just a quickie really on the fact that interest rates are only going to go one way over the next 2 or 3 years, although probably never going back to where they used to be. Are we now looking at moving some of our short-term borrowing onto fixed rates and moving it sooner rather than later?
Yes and no. Again, it's a slightly complex picture because we've got the Waste Authority coming in, so we've got a substantial amount of internal borrowing at the present time. It was about 400 million last time I looked. We've got the Waste Authority coming in. Their transferred in debt will be up to 700 million pounds following the historic debt and the buyout of the PFI. So we're trying to look at it in the round. Actually, tomorrow, 150 million pounds arrives from the European Investment Bank, which we settled a deal with 2 weeks ago to borrow 25-year money at less than 2% from the EIB. So we are on fixing some bits of it, and we will be looking again to draw down some more for the collective whole, including Waste. Waste borrowed 120 million at the time of the PFI refinancing, so they've fixed some of theirs, and we need to look at the round. The cash flows of the new CA from April will be quite positive. We will be generating cash, so we certainly won't be borrowing all the money longer term, because we'd be repaying 50 to 100 million a year through our normal sort of revenue drawdown. So we'll probably borrow more of it, but not fully funded. And I mean, interest rates are expected to go up, but still be, in comparison to the history, sort of next to nothing. I mean, 5-year investment rates are something like 1.2% at the moment. So there's a ready market out there for sort of five-year money at very little rate, before we go to Public Works Loan Board, which is relatively expensive given the margins. Interestingly, government put out yesterday that there will be allowing authorities to bid for cheaper Public Works Loan Board. They're going to make £1 billion available over the next 2 years to borrow at a lesser margin from PWLB. So again, we'll be looking at that. It doesn't make a huge difference. It's 20 basis points, 0.2% off the interest rate. But if rates are at 2%, then it's 10% saving on your interest. So we will look at that. So yeah, the Treasury strategy will come through the Audit Committee in their January meeting, and we'll look at the prospect of some more borrowing. We're talking to the European Investment Bank again about some of the funding for the Trafford Park line. They're interested in they're interested in some cheap money. It's always worth borrowing. If you're going to borrow, you might as well borrow as cheap as you can. So they are interested pre-Brexit in lending some more money to that. So that would be a cheaper source of funding if we can get that.
I only smile then because, as you know, none of the money for trams ever comes to Stockport.
So from traffic, so I've got one question myself. I don't know if it's for fire. I don't know if it's for you really. Obviously, the mayor and deputy mayor have taken this decision not to make these savings. I'm relatively new to it. Could I have a deeper explanation of that? I would imagine if we'd agreed the savings, we've done all the work, but then we've just wasted all that work because we've put it on suspense.
They haven't agreed not to make the savings. They've deferred the savings for a year whilst we look at the plan in which the savings were going to be generated. So it's not that those savings won't have to be found, because they will. We're just going to look again at where we might be able to find those savings from.
And have the fire service kicked back against that, or have just said, you know what, we're happy with that and we'll go away with it? Or, because again, I would consider you'd done the work.
We did the work, but obviously when that three-year plan was designed, that was some 2 years ago, and the assumptions that that plan was based upon have obviously changed. We're now part of the combined authority, and it makes good sense to revisit those assumptions and to check out the viability of that plan.
Appreciate that answer, that's great, thank you. I hope there's no more questions. Great, so we have been asked to, get my glasses, note the AGMA revenue outturn position for 2017-18, which is showing an overspend of 0.2 million, and note the economic development and regeneration revenue outturn position for 2017-18, which showing an underspend of 0.331 million against budget, and note the transport revenue outturn position for 2017-18, which is in line with the budget after transfer of earmarked reserves, and note the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue outturn position for 2017-18, which is showing the underspend of 5.5 million, and note the progress of the 2018-19 budget setting process. Are we happy to note all of those?
I think on 4 you're noting that actually that position has been revised.
Of course, yes. Thank you. That has been revised too. I think it was it 2.5 million or something of that order.
Yeah, we'll need to
So-
recast those numbers.
So apart from section 4, which we're only noting it. So are we happy to note those things? Yes. I would ask that as papers and this develops over the coming month, as sections are complete, could the committee have them? I think the committee would perhaps appreciate those as soon as sections are available, to at least give us the opportunity to bring ourselves up to speed before the next meeting, because it's going to form quite a substantial part of the next meeting.
Yeah, I think in practice, given Christmas is in the way, that it's not going to be much before the next meeting. I did pick up explanation of earn back and the capital side, so we can get on with that. I think the revenue budget items will. I think most people are off until the sort of 2nd or 3rd of January. I'm not off, I should be working on this, but the scrutiny meetings are sort of scheduled for the week the 3rd to the 5th of January, so we'll get figures out as soon as we can, but it's not going to be, certainly not this side of the new year, because we will be working on them over the Christmas period.
Thank you for that. And then on to Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, prevention, protection and response risks. Dawn.
Thank you, Chair. I think really this paper forms a suite of papers in which we hope to discuss various aspects of the Fire and Rescue Services offer. And in this paper we've concentrated on prevention and some of our concerns around the delivery of prevention. If you see in the background that it is one of our primary services that we should deliver, and that we have as an organisation risen to this challenge and delivered home fire safety checks since about 2006. Indeed, as I showed in the graph earlier, we've delivered into homes sometimes at 1 year it was up to 90,000 homes. The reason why this is so important is about the socio-demographics in the Greater Manchester area. There obviously is a correlation between deprivation and also the incidence of fire. And these factors which we then look at, and we realise that we need to deliver and target the people that come under this area. The map that is in the pack, that actually shows the distribution of the index of multiple deprivation, and this, I've only got the one for 2015. But you can see that most of these areas are in the metropolitan areas, and the table below that shows the proportion of the lower super output areas which are in the most deprived in the country, and you can see a number of Greater Manchester boroughs in there. We've talked about the success of prevention and the fact that we've seen a steady reduction in fires overall by 21% since 2011-12. And this success in prevention has been noted by our partners, and they've actually come to us to see whether we can assist in their prevention agenda. And I've included in this paper an excerpt from the speech delivered by Jackie White, who is England's Deputy Director for Long-Term Conditions. And you can see in that excerpt from that speech how she recognises that actually, yeah, we are a health asset. The Fire and Rescue Service could be delivering something that is a benefit, far wider benefit to the nation than simply preventing fires. And we have been at the forefront of this work, developing our home safety check into the safe and well check. Our concern is obviously around the funding issues, and that you see that over the last 6 years, £141 million has been deducted from the spending power of English fire and rescue services. We ourselves, over the period of time between 2009-10 and 2015-16, have saved in the region of 25% of the services budget, which equates to around £42 million in savings. And this has been achieved through reduction in number of firefighters, support staff, and prevention staff, and senior management. And we continue to look for ways in order to meet our saving targets. The real concern is that as funding continues to reduce, there could be a temptation to concentrate on what is considered to be core, or shall I say some people consider to be core, which is simply the response service. And this is a false economy, because should we retreat back into just doing the response service, then we will see the number of fires and incidents increase. We will see an increased demand. We will need to have to then increase our fire cover. And the savings that we've been able to generate will be negated. So the paper really is not so much a proposal as a concern around the fact that the service needs to maintain both its prevention agenda and its response capability. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that, Dawn. Start with John.
Yes, Chairman. Well, you know, having been involved with these decisions, Dawn, that you've brought up tonight, I've often said that I think that the fire service in Greater Manchester are victims of our own success. And that only goes for Greater Manchester, but many other fire brigades up and down the country. And I think it has to be recognised by government that just what we've done in collaboration. We have saved a lot of money. We've helped with running the National Health Service. My regret is that we've led the way on cardiac arrests. Perhaps you can put us in what the present situation is there, because with the dispute with the FBU, I understand that call-outs to cardiac arrest have finished for the time being. And we did a tremendous amount of work on that. And if that's still ongoing, then it's very regrettable indeed that it has stopped. I have always been of the opinion that the fire service should always be on every local authority's health and well-being board, as we are very much part of the safety of the public, and that's collaboration with police, ambulance. We opened a new fire station yesterday in Wigan, which showed the collaboration there's been over the last few years. So could you tell me what the situation with cardiac arrests and what the future is there? And also, I understand there may be a couple of local authorities in the conurbation that have no representation on health and well-being boards, and I think it's very important that they are represented.
Thank you. If I can respond in terms of what we call EMR, emergency medical response, which includes the attendance at cardiac arrest, red ones we call them, for a period of time, for over 18 months in fact, all of our fire engines were responding to cardiac arrests, and we had significant positive interaction with the public in terms of that, saved many lives, supported our NWAS, North West Ambulance Service colleagues in that. Unfortunately, it was seen as part of a national pilot, and again, to support you in what you said there in terms of leading the way, we were the only fire and rescue service in the country where all our fire engines were responding to cardiac arrests. Unfortunately, that withdrawal from the pilot had, because of all our fire engines responding, had significant impact on us. There is some light there, though. We know that the Mayor, Andy, is extremely passionate about our firefighters responding to emergency medical response, cardiac arrests. I believe he's working with the Fire Brigades Union, who ceased their involvement in the pilot some months ago. We've had a significant engagement with our firefighters. They are extremely keen to carry on with responding to those incidents. However, they feel they need to be recompensed for that attendance, which again is supported by the Mayor. You're right, we do have a significant role in terms of fire and rescue services nationally in supporting other areas of public service, including the National Health Service, and that's actually recognised by the Fire Brigades Union again in a paper they released about the wider role of the fire and rescue service in that. Again, all these issues are surrounding national pay negotiations. So unfortunately, from a Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service point of view, we have to wait for the national negotiations, the national work, supported by Greater Manchester and the Mayor of Greater Manchester, to progress before we can continue or get back into those areas of work.
Can I just pick up on your second point around membership of health and wellbeing boards? Can you tell me, is it because we've not been invited or we're not attending?
Well, I don't want to... I know of one authority in Greater Manchester, and I don't want to publicly reveal here who that is, but certainly not. It's not 100%. And it is by invitation by the local authority, and very much so. And I know my own local authority in Tameside, we were one of the first to involve ourselves on health and wellbeing boards, and we play a major part in what is happening in Tameside. And I'd just love to see every local authority in Greater Manchester signing up to it.
Thank you, except that we'll pick that up outside this meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. In response to your question there, I asked the same question as Councillor Bell has raised at our September meeting. I did get an email response from a senior officer fire service. I haven't got it obviously with me tonight, but I'm sure Gwyn could pull that email off that question I made in September about NHS and getting on the wellbeing boards, and they could forward that to you to see what was the response then. It may well change now you're in position. But what I was going to go on to say is, in my fire service career, I found the fire service to be an enigma, and particularly when I got into the senior fire service position where you're setting budgets, planning for the future. Because being a head of fire safety department, I was totally committed to what you're doing, getting out and making airports safer, making industrial places safer places to go, making leisure premises safer places to visit, etc. You know, after the fire, Bradford fire and things like that. But the thing that was happening in the fire service, the greater success at fire safety, and your slide of 206 showing you had 3,700 fires in 206, 2015 that was down to 2,200. Politicians, and I'm not saying any particular party, politicians will see that you've got 1/3 less workload. You need 1/3 less officers, men and machines. They don't look that you've shifted your resources from responding to fires to let's get to the core of the problem, speak to the people in the home, speak to the vulnerable, go in our communities. I totally endorse what the fire service has been doing. Since I left, I can't claim any credit for this. This is fresh ideas, fresh momentum. I absolutely, totally endorse what you're doing, and Councillor Bell is absolutely right. We're leading the way, and it saddens me we've had to step aside because of some FBU dispute. I'm still a member of the FBU, so I don't want to say too much about. But, you know, you're on the right track. We've got to keep doing that. Manchester is leading the way, and we've got to sell that to the politicians, the mind change. We've got to get there where before the fires start, the vulnerable people, the alcoholics, the people who've got other social issues which are making them vulnerable to a fire. So I totally endorse where you're going. It's sad that your success has been rewarded by having to cut your budget and cut your fire engines, but that's the life we're living at the moment. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to that at all, or just take those comments? Okay, that's great. I've got a couple of comments I might draw. The safe and well, I've got some experience of that within our own ward, in that we found a pot of money to help fund that, to tackle isolation in the elderly as well, and then signpost that out to other agencies. That worked well. Is there any way that you could tap into funding from? Because I know you go out and do things that seem relatively irrelevant, like stick rubber bungs on the bottom of people's walking sticks, which seems so trivial. But if that saves a fall, it saves thousands of pounds. Have you looked to tapping into social care funding and that sort of stuff? Is there any scope for that, or are we stuck where we are and we have to advocate for it?
Thank you. In terms of another paper that will be presented in a moment, it talks about our outturn report and how we progress over the years. One of our key principles or values is about public value, and the safe and well concept not only is obviously there to benefit the resident we're visiting and making them safe, but actually recognising the value that firefighters have when they go into homes, and how they can support other agencies who aren't as able as we are to get into those homes. So initially, in terms of our safe and well that's been developed only over recent years, our influence and our drive was about public value and the benefit for the member of the public that we were visiting then. We have had discussions, and they're only initial discussions in terms of being commissioned for work such as that, but it hasn't progressed to this date.
And then one more question. Just going back to your Dawn's comments with respect to becoming just a response service to tackle fires as opposed to a prevention service. Are there any worldwide studies? Because I think it's down to people like us to advocate for your services, really. Are there any worldwide studies that we could draw upon to say, well, okay, in X country or X state, they went back to just rescue, and this is what we've ended up with? Or do you not know about it?
I think there's more studies to say how successful fire and rescue services have been in the UK, and how internationally, globally, fire and rescue services are looking at us to see how we do it in terms of that prevention. I've been lucky enough position, not just on holiday, but to visit fire and rescue services globally, and they will point at a purely response fire and rescue service that they have, and have not gone down the prevention route that we have, and look at us in some sort of envy in that way, especially in terms of the United States of America. I know that a lot of theirs is purely down to response, but I've not known a fire and rescue service yet that has gone from response to prevention and then decided to go back to only response.
Appreciate that. Any more comments, questions? So can we note that report, please? Yeah. This fire service show tonight. So annual report from the fire service. Don't want to have it overloaded on your only third week.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes, the Greater Manchester Fire Authority, and now the Mayor, has a statutory duty to produce a corporate plan, and you've heard us mention it. It's the Integrated Risk Management Plan, and the current plan covers the period 2016 to 2020. And this plan looks at the risks that our communities could face, and it looks at emerging corporate threats and opportunities, and looks to see how we can develop our fire cover to meet these risks, but also our prevention agenda to mitigate these risks. Obviously, you need to reflect on how we're working against that plan. And so we have produced the annual report for 2016-17, which looks about how we are performing against these aspirations. And you can see there that it's split over the main aims. And I do hope you've been able to have a copy of this annual report. I know it was there was a link in the report, not printed off. But it's split over prevention, protection, response, public value, as Tony has mentioned, financial information, and people. And we've just put a few bullet points there in the report that to highlight some of the things that we'd like to bring to your attention. So last year we went into 28,000 homes and had the face-to-face safety advice, which includes fire advice, crime prevention and health promotion advice. We've seen a reduction in non-domestic fires fallen by 6% this year and 34% the trend since 2009-10. And our response times are actually a minute quicker than the national average response times for all fire and rescue services in England. The community rooms on fire stations, showed you the picture earlier of the joint police, fire and ambulance station, and within that, those stations we have developed community rooms, and they've been used by almost 6,700 times by charities and community groups. And the volunteers that I spoke about earlier, those 400 volunteers, they've provided almost 36 hours of free service to the public. And we've also, we're very proud of our green policy and that our carbon footprint has reduced by 40% since our baseline assessment in 2008-9. I'd just like to recommend the annual report to you and willing to take any questions.
Any questions? Quite a successful report, that then. If no questions, I'm sure it won't always be like this, but anyway. Thank you for that, and can we note that report? That's great, thank you. And again, fire service, but a different presentation. Gwen, governance update, please.
Thank you, Chairman. On the last occasion, the committee asked for a briefing note on governance arrangements for fire. I think if we just take a step back to May, when the under the devolution deals and the fire order abolished the former Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Authority, and it transferred the functions to the CA. Though it made the functions mayoral, however, so all those functions are the responsibility of the elected mayor. Within the order, that there are certain matters that the mayor can't delegate, and they're set out within the report at the bottom of page 2. And if I just run through what some of those are, arrangements under sections 13 and 16 of the Fire and Rescue Services Act. They're the formal arrangements we would make with our neighbouring fire authorities to assist us in the event of a major incident, for example. So they would be reinforcement schemes, and occasionally we might be better placed to serve a particular area of a neighbouring authority, so we would actually discharge those functions for them. Section 15 is a provision which relates to other employers of firefighters, so they can discharge functions for our service. And the most common one would be the airport fire service, which might discharge some functions for us round about the airport. The mayor must personally appoint or dismiss, approve the terms and conditions of the chief fire officer and hold him to account. The mayor is responsible for approving the local risk plan, which is what we know is the integrated risk management plan, which Dawn has spoken about. The Fire and Rescue National Framework makes provision for us to produce an annual assurance statement, and again the mayor must approve that personally, and approve business continuity plans and civil contingency arrangements with the category 1 and 2 responders. So they're the matters the mayor must exercise himself. He has the ability to delegate functions to to officers of the CA, which he has. He's delegated functions to the Chief Fire Officer and functions to the Head of Paid Service. The fire order also allows the Mayor to establish a fire committee, which he has done. That has 15 members, and the names of the members are set out in section 4.2 of the report. Recently, the fire committee has met informally and considered some terms of reference drafted for them, and I understand that they are almost, if not actually, agreed, and that they are pretty much advisory in nature. So I think last time the question was asked about what your role is, what as opposed to the fire committee's role. Well, the fire committee is appointed by the Mayor, so it wouldn't be appropriate for the fire committee to conduct a scrutiny role in relation to the Mayor's own discharge of his functions. So statutorily, the CA is obliged to set up overview and scrutiny of all its functions, and you are an independent committee appointed by the CA on the nomination of your district, so better placed to carry out overview and scrutiny. So in the report, we set out some suggestions for your forward plan for scrutinising fire and rescue functions. You're able to scrutinise functions of the Mayor, of the Fire Committee, and of any officers who have delegated functions in relation to fire. And we're suggesting that you look at financial performance, including the operational risk register of the Fire and Rescue Service, and high-level overview of capital spend, and also quarterly reporting on service performance, call-out times, workforce matters, and ensuring that we're playing our part in the GM strategy. So I think that's fairly brief. If members have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer.
Very much, John. So we'll start with John. Anybody else for questions?
I don't want to appear to be a dinosaur, but you've got to realise that I've been involved with it for a long, long time, fire and rescue. And the report that Gwyn has given here, broadly, I agree with. But there is, with the fire committee, it seems to me that we have more powers here than the fire committee. And I can't speak for the lads and lasses on the fire committee, but it would appear that we do seem to have more powers here. Having said that, I know just how onerous it is to run a fire brigade the size of Greater Manchester. And it is massive. It's like running a small local authority. And I don't know the terms of reference that have been given to the fire committee, but I think it's right and proper that this scrutiny committee should see what those terms of references are for the fire committee once they've been agreed. I think that 4 times a year for this committee to have a look at what the fire service is doing is quite adequate. But if you think you can run a fire brigade the size of Greater Manchester and the presence that Greater Manchester Fire Service has throughout the country on a 4-weekly, and I understand, I've been told that it could be, the fire committee could only be meeting 4 times a year. That will be totally inadequate. Either that or Andy is going to have one hell of a job. He's going to, to deal with all the matters arising from it, because, we've lived with it, having been on the old fire authority. So, I know it's early days, and I don't want to appear a dinosaur, but I'm only speaking from my own personal experience and looking, and mixing with other fire authorities throughout the country. you know, we're still learning, really, with this new regime under an elected mayor. And, you know, let's see how it goes.
Is there a question there? Is there anything? There is a question, but could you perhaps package that so we can actually ask a question and get?
I mean, I don't know. I am not privy to the discussions that go on behind the scenes since last April, but I understand that the fire committee have only met twice officially, not. And I know they've met. Informally, but I just wonder how things are running, you know, with under those circumstances. It's frightening to me with the size of the budget and what it has to do. And of course also at the same time, the management team within the fire service in Greater Manchester has altered considerably. And we welcome it to Greater Manchester Dawn, and I noticed that Paul over there and Tony are working inside the combined authority now. So it may be, you know, and probably Andrew can answer this one for me. I don't know what they're supposed to do within the combined authority, but perhaps, you know, it might help me in my observations, having been on the old fire authority. How things are running and what your plans are.
So, Tone, I sort of got the sense you had some sort of answer, or was that just bad body language? Just bad. Right. So, over to you, Andrew.
Well, there's clearly issues that everyone's aware of around the transition to these new governance arrangements, and we're at the start of the journey. It's been done before in terms of a much larger emergency service. So a police authority used to oversee the police force, 4 times the size of fire in budgetary terms, a police authority with 30 plus members on. That changed 4 or 5 years ago. PCCs were established with responsibility, police and crime panel overseeing them. Different legislative framework, but a similar model is what we've got now. So there is a role for the fire committee, but it's not the fire authority. It's there to support the mayor in the exercise of his fire duties. So certainly the terms of reference can be circulated for the fire committee, but I'd suggest your primary purpose is to hold the mayor to account for the exercise of his fire functions, which Gwyn has outlined in the report that you've received. And if that means the mayor attending to talk with you about his thoughts, ideas on the future direction of fire, then he's more than prepared to be here. But this is a different governance arrangement, fundamentally different governance arrangement that was enshrined in legislation, in orders that have been passed, and there are limits to what we can do in terms of replicating what existed before the election of the mayor.
Thank you for that. Tim, just a question?
Thank you. So it's not a question, it's a thought. I suppose none of us would really want to have the situation where 2 groups of 15 councillors were having the same discussions and were having a discussion with officers and fire officers on the same agenda, essentially, because that seems like a complete waste of time. Really. I think we need to be very careful to avoid doing that. And one thought is that if we're one step slightly more independent because we've not been appointed from the mayor, then one of the things that might make set our agenda on this is that we can actually choose which issues we wish to delve into a little more. So I think when we do this quarterly look at fire issues, rather than just receive whatever the fire committee should receive, which I'm sure is not the plan, we need to be quite forceful as a committee and say we want to delve into this in 3 months' time or something like that, and not duplicate, I suppose. So there's just some thoughts, Joe, really.
Appreciate that. I would support that. Right, I'm going to start with Michael. Your maiden comments at our committee meeting, and then we'll move to Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Just really on the scrutiny aspect of it, because obviously we are in a new sort of like era of scrutiny, and obviously with the directly elected mayor as well, and just picking up you know, the previous point about delving into specific issues from a scrutiny perspective. And I know I'm perhaps straying on to the work programme a little bit, but I think it is important that we get the Mayor here, at least on an annual basis, to actually look at that performance over the previous 12 months. And given the challenges that we've already discussed today in terms of where we're going as a fire and rescue service, what that's going to look like as part of the devolution agreement as well, because I think there's a real opportunity here to start breaking some of that silo working down that we've got across all public sector as well, to start to think with the Mayor where he anticipates that's going, because we can actually be quite radical in Greater Manchester because we've got the opportunity and obviously the structures in place. So I certainly think that he should come here on an annual basis and answer some of those questions about performance over the last 12 months, but also to look at some of the areas outlining where he's going and what he's really starting to really grab hold of this initiative that he should really be showing now in terms of where he wants to take it, because he's got a golden opportunity, and that's where us collectively I think we need to be holding into account and saying, right, start to show us that thinking about where you want to take us over the next 5 years.
Thank you, Michael. Neil?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm referring back to the report, actually, in sections 4.3 and 4.4, which I think do a very good job at explaining what this committee should be doing and where and what we should be putting into our agenda. I agree totally that we need to speak to the Mayor on an annual basis. I think that's only fair and proper. But I think that should be able to work out our work schedule quite nightly from those items there at 4.3 and 4.4.
I would agree with that. Tony, got some comments?
Yeah, just to add to the fact that it's our job as members of the Fire and Rescue Service to broaden your understanding of the Fire and Rescue Service as well. So not only during presentations like this, the scrutiny items, but obviously for you to see firsthand what it's like on a Fire and Rescue Service station, what it's like at the facilities where we train our operational firefighters to deal with the most challenging of situations, which are obviously the operational side. We've invested a significant amount of money into a new training development site in Bury. So it's our job to put opportunities in front of you where you can learn more about us, so when we're talking about it and when you're scrutinising us, you know more about us.
So I might suggest you put some dates together for, perhaps beyond January, but just throw a few out there. Not too many. You offer the dates and we'll either take you up on them and let's get some people down some fire stations and just see so we can understand it from a great depth. So I'd appreciate that.
I'm sure Stella and I would like to welcome you all to Bury, actually, to that training centre for our meeting when we're talking about fire once. It's a very, very nice place, Bury, apparently. Yes.
Great. Any other comments on that report? No. So thank you for that, Gwyn. That's great. I'm going to move on to work programme. I need to borrow your timetable. So, within this, I would like to try and cover task and finish groups for school readiness. We've had a couple of volunteers, and then potentially there's a lot of passion on this fire. I think we might need a subgroup, a task and finish group on fire, in that it's so broad, and we'd like budget effectively probably take up our next virtually whole meeting. So there we are. So we've had 2 volunteers already for task and finish on school readiness. Gwyn, have you got that list? I've not got that list.
I think we've got Councillor Elijah, who's already expressed an interest. Councillor Smith, have you expressed an interest? Yes, so I think we were looking for one more.
Okay, that gives us 3, so that's fine, so we could put that forward. And then, I suppose fire, really. There's been lots of passion about fire. I think John would be a reasonable starting point. I don't think that's good or bad for the fire service, but, Yeah. I think we need more than just... No. We need more than 3 in that... the other group's probably going to be cross scrutiny, the 3 scrutinies, whereas this will solely be our responsibility. So don't all rush, but John McGann, Peter Malcolm.
Bear in mind, Chair, I'm only a substitute, but if you want to co-opt me to that subgroup, I'm very
yeah, I think
happy
we can
to
do
attend
that. We
that.
can do that with that subgroup. Okay, and if we could perhaps send an email out to the rest of the committee, so we can get that, try and pull that together. So then, moving on to the work programme.
Sorry to interrupt before you move on. I wouldn't like anybody to think that school readiness was just a women's issue. You know, they say as a You say this will have other people in it from the other scrutiny panel.
The school readiness will, and maybe we could look at the gender balance at least on that. I know it has been mentioned once.
It just sort of suddenly struck me, you know.
Yeah.
Going through. Thank you.
And that, thank you for bringing that to my attention. And maybe the same does apply to fire. Well, I think there's got to be a root interest and a root passion towards it. Otherwise,
Chair, I am aware that the Mayor has said that any committee under the combined authority must have a gender balance. So you probably, I don't know about task and finish groups, it's not as important, but I know that's what he says anyhow.
so at that we need at least a female on fire. Let's see. So that at this point in time, I think there is only you two. So don't feel obliged, but let's do the email, see who comes forward, and then we might have to rejig the volunteers at a later date. But in the interim, and then let's see what comes out from the combined committees for the task and finish group on school readiness at least. Okay, so thank you for that, though. Right, so moving on. Obviously, January is budgets. It has been suggested that the homelessness move to the Housing and Planning Committee because they, I'm not saying control, but they're scrutinising the housing and it's a little bit more of their remit. As now we've assumed and fully understand our responsibilities with respect to fire, maybe I'm quite content to not do that in the short term. We can always call it back. Have we got any comments from the committee?
Yeah, I mean, certainly my understanding of homelessness is that public services are quite important for resolving that issue. Whereas, of course, housing is important as well. It's very much a public service issue as far as I'm concerned.
Are you saying you'd like to retain it? You are. Has the rest of the committee got any comments upon that? None. So I'm going to suggest we kick that down the road for the time being, because at least another scrutiny committee is going to pick that up in the short term. Because we've got the whole of the budget in January, of which we've had scant detail now, and it took a good hour, maybe over an hour, just on this meeting, on the information we had. So what I will do, I'll go back to the combined chairs and speak about that again, and your passion. There doesn't seem, the rest of the committee is not overly supportive on that, but I'll go back to combined chairs and just take a view on that, and maybe we take a report at some point. Sheila.
Just to say, Chair, that I take Luke's point, but so it's important that we keep communications going between the two committees, and so we know what they've discussed.
It's not as if the other committees aren't going to take comments and some other contributions. So I'll go back to the joint chairs and we'll have another conversation on that and look to bring that back in, but not in January, if that's okay. But I won't fully at this point relinquish that. We've got budgets in January. I nearly think that might be enough, actually. Unless, yeah, I think it will be. So moving on, we've got to February. We've got the accredited living wage. We've got a report coming back on that, which we've already had a presentation. I can't remember if it was the last meeting. From I think it was the one before actually. To get accredited as a living wage authority, quite important. Communications, a lot to do on communications, on brand awareness, and actually, even members within Greater Manchester not having a full knowledge of what we're all about. We need to get that out there. So communications, Neil, you'd expressed an interest in that. So over, go on.
It's really a bit of outstanding business really from previous committees really. But I think you'll find in any organisation communication is a key issue, and I think it's got to fall under this particular committee as being a major part of what we do, and not least communicating how GM is developing and the way that the structure's going in the future. I think that this committee is quite responsible for that particular area. So, you know, we know it's developing, it's probably early stages, we've probably not got a lot to tell yet, but we've got to keep that communication going and getting the message across to the general public of what we're actually doing.
So, I would hope the starting point will be to report to where we're at. Let's get an update from the Combined Authority to where we're at. I'm going to take David first and then come to you, John.
Yeah, I was actually on that subgroup last year, so I'll be interested to see what's developed from there, because obviously because of the change of things we didn't get any feedback. But it would be also worthwhile contacting Councillor Stodger. Is it Angelica Stodger who chaired that committee? There's a lot of work on it actually, to see if you could come or at least give her input. That would be, I think, be useful, because she's now one of the lead members, I think.
I think we've got a report from her, and I think we're going to try and contact her and get her, if she's available, get her to that meeting. John McGann.
Thanks, Chair. Now, that was exactly as we discussed earlier, that I was going to say let's invite Angelica to the meeting. Just send her a formal invite. I mean, if she can't come, she can't come, but hopefully she can spare that time.
And then, short update with respect to school readiness. I think we're probably ready for a short update. By that time, we'll be 3 months since we had an update, so we'll pick up on that. Is everybody happy with that for the February meeting? Great, which then moves us on to March. We've been asked to consider waste, because obviously we're coming out of the PFI, new contracts to be, so the actual transition will become our responsibility. Once it's transitioned, it will go over to environment, but in the short term, so we're going to drop I think a basic report on waste and where it's at, so we can at least all understand it into March. And school ready to learn, I think that I'm probably going to follow on from February, that. So, but that's in the diary for now. But I also think in March we're going to be ready for a brief fire report. Really, if we are saying we're going to be doing it quarterly, we've got to start doing it quarterly. However painful it is with respect to the diary. Can I write on this? So that's waste and fire. Taking us to April, GM strategy implementation plan update. I think we're actually, everything is evolving so quickly. I don't think we can, for me, I don't think we can schedule what we're going to do in April at this stage. Any comments unless anybody's got any passion about stuff? There we go, I think we're there. Future meeting dates. You'll all be pleased to know we're at Trafford. You can get the metro. You could get the bus into town, John, and get the metro. So we're at Trafford Council on the 16th of January, then back here in February on the 20th of February. You've all got the dates, fairly straightforward. Any other brief comments, anything you'd like to mention? No, that's great. I'll wind it up at that. Thank you all, and have a cracking Christmas and New Year. I'll see you in January.